Mary Pope Osborne Magic Treehouse Number 2. The Night at Dawn. Chapter 6. Ta-da! In the torchlight, Jack saw 3 huge men standing over him. One with very squinty eyes held the torch, one with a very red face held Jack, and one with a very long mustache held on to Annie. Annie was kicking and yelling. "Stop!" said the one with the very long mustache. "Who are you?" said the one with the very red face. "Spies, foreigners, Egyptians, Romans, Persians," said the squinty-eyed one. "No, you dummies," said Annie. "Oh, brother," Jack muttered. "Arrest them," said Red Face. "The dungeon," said Squinty Eyes. The guards marched Jack and Annie out of the armory. "Go," said a guard, giving him a push. Jack went. Squinty, Annie, Mustache, Jack, and Red marched down the long, dark hallway. They marched down a narrow, winding staircase. Jack heard Annie shouting at the guards. "Meanies! We didn't do anything!" The guards laughed. At the bottom of the stairs was a big iron door with a bar across it. Squinty lifted the bar. He shoved the door, and it creaked open. Mustache and Red pushed Jack and Annie into a cold, clammy room. The fiery torch lit the dungeon. There were chains hanging from the filthy walls. Water dripped from the ceiling, making puddles on the stone floor. It was the creepiest place Jack had ever seen. "We'll keep them here till the feast is done. Then turn them over to the Duke," said Squinty. "He knows how to take care of thieves." "There will be a hanging tomorrow," said Mustache. "If the rats don't get them first," said Red. They all laughed. Jack felt his backpack move. Annie was quietly opening it. "Come on, let's chain the 2 of them," said Squinty. The guards started toward Jack and Annie. Annie whipped her flashlight out of Jack's pack. "Ta-da!" she yelled. The guards froze. They stared at the shiny flashlight in Annie's hand. Annie switched on the light. The guards gasped. They jumped back against the wall. Squinty dropped the torch. It fell into a dirty puddle on the floor, sputtered, and went out. "My magic wand," Annie said, waving the flashlight. "Get down, or I'll wipe you out." Jack's mouth dropped open. Annie fiercely pointed her light at Squinty, then at Mustache, and then at Red. Each howled and covered his face. "Down, all of you, get down," shouted Annie. One by one, the guards knelt down on the wet floor. Jack couldn't believe it. "Come on," Annie whispered to Jack. "Let's go now." Jack looked at the open doorway. He looked at the guards quaking on the ground. "Hurry," said Annie. In one quick leap, Jack followed Annie out of the terrible dungeon. Chapter 7. A Secret Passage. Annie and Jack raced back up the winding stairs and down the long hallway. They hadn't gone far when they heard shouting behind them. Dogs barked in the distance. "They're coming!" Annie cried. "In here," said Jack. He shoved open a door off the hallway and pulled Annie into a dark room. Jack pushed the door shut. Then Annie shined her flashlight around the room. There were rows of sacks and wooden barrels. "I'd better look in the book," said Jack, pulling out the book and flipping through the pages. "Shh," said Annie. "Someone's coming." Jack and Annie jumped behind the door as it creaked open. Jack held his breath. A light from a torch danced wildly over the sacks and barrels. The light disappeared. The door slammed shut. "Oh, man," whispered Jack. "We have to hurry. They might come back." His hands were trembling as he turned the pages of the castle book. "Here's a map of the castle," he said. "Look, this must be the room we're in. It's a storeroom." Jack studied the room in the book. "These are sacks of flour and barrels of wine." "Who cares? We have to go," said Annie. "Before they come back." "No, look," said Jack. He pointed at the map. "There's a trap door." He read aloud, "In this castle, A trapdoor led from the storeroom through a secret passage to a precipice over the moat. "What's a precipice?" said Annie. "I don't know. We'll find out," said Jack. "But first we have to find the trapdoor." Jack looked at the picture carefully. Then he shined the flashlight around the room. The floor of the room was made of stones. The trapdoor in the picture was 5 stones from the door to the hallway. Jack shined the light on the floor and counted the stones out loud. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He stamped on the 5th stone. It was loose. Jack put the flashlight on the floor. He worked his fingers under the thin slab of stone and tried to lift it. "Help," Jack said. "It's heavy." Annie helped Jack lift the stone square out of its place. Underneath was a small wooden door. Jack and Annie tugged on the rope handle of the door. The door fell open with a thunk. Jack picked up the flashlight and shined it down the hole. "There's a little ladder," he said. "Let's go." He clipped the flashlight onto his belt and felt his way down the small ladder. Annie followed. When they reached the bottom of the ladder, Jack shined the light around them. There was a tunnel. Jack crouched down and began moving through the damp, creepy tunnel. The flashlight dimly flickered across the stone walls. He shook the light. Were the batteries going dead? "I think our light's dying," he said to Annie. "Hurry!" she called from behind him. Jack went faster. His back hurt from crouching. The light got dimmer and dimmer. Jack was desperate to get out of the castle before the batteries died completely. Soon he reached another small wooden door. It was the door at the end of the tunnel. Jack unlatched the door and pushed it open. He poked his head outside. He couldn't see anything in the misty darkness. The air felt cool and fresh. He took a deep breath. "Where are we?" whispered Annie behind him. "What do you see?" "Nothing." "But I think we've come to the outside of the castle," said Jack. "I'll find out." Jack put the flashlight in his pack. He put the pack on his back. He stuck his hand out the door. He couldn't feel the ground. "I'm going to have to go feet first," he said. Jack turned around in the small tunnel. He lay down on his stomach. He stuck one leg out the door, then the other. Jack inched down bit by bit until he was hanging out the door, clinging to the ledge. "This must be the precipice," he called to Annie. "I can't touch the ground. Pull me up." Annie reached for Jack's hands. "I can't hold you," she said. Jack felt his fingers slipping. Then down he fell through the darkness. Splash! Chapter 8. The night. Water filled Jack's nose and covered his head. His glasses slipped off. He grabbed them just in time. He coughed and flailed his arms. "Jack," Annie was calling from above. "I'm in the moat," said Jack, gasping for air. He tried to tread water and put his glasses back on. With his backpack, his shoes, and his heavy clothes, he could barely stay afloat. Splash. "Hi, I'm here," Annie sputtered. Jack could hear Annie nearby, but he couldn't see her. "Which way's land?" Annie asked. "I don't know. Just swim." Jack dog-paddled through the cold black water. He heard Annie swimming, too. At first it seemed as if she was swimming in front of him, but then he heard a splash behind him. "Annie?" he called. "What?" Her voice came from in front, not behind. Another splash, behind. Jack's heart almost stopped. "Crocodiles?" He couldn't see anything through his water-streaked glasses. "Annie," he whispered. "What?" "Swim faster." "But I'm over here, near the edge," she whispered. Jack swam through the dark toward her voice. He imagined a crocodile slithering after him. Jack's hand touched a wet, live thing. "Ah," he cried. "It's me, take my hand," said Annie. Jack grabbed her hand. She pulled him to the edge of the moat. They crawled over an embankment onto the wet grass. "Oh man," Jack said. He was shivering all over. His teeth were chattering. He shook the water off his glasses and put them back on. It was so misty he couldn't see the castle. He couldn't even see the moat, much less a crocodile. We made it," said Annie. Her teeth were chattering too. "I know," said Jack. "But where are we?" He peered at the foggy darkness. Where was the drawbridge? The windmill? The hawk house? The grove of trees? The tree house? Everything had been swallowed up by the thick, soupy darkness. Jack reached into his wet backpack and pulled out the flashlight. He pushed the switch. Nothing happened. The batteries were dead. They were trapped, but not in a dungeon. They were trapped in the still, cold darkness. Knee-high horse's whinny echoed through the night. The clouds parted. A full moon was shining in the sky. A pool of light spread through the mist. Jack and Annie saw a shadowy figure just a few feet away. It was the knight. The knight sat on the black horse. His armor shone in the moonlight. A visor hid his face, but he seemed to be staring straight at Jack and Annie. Chapter 9. Under the Moon. Jack froze. "It's him," Annie whispered. The knight held out his gloved hand. "Come on, Jack," Annie said. "Where are you going?" said Jack. "He wants to help us," said Annie. "How do you know?" said Jack. "I can just tell," said Annie. Annie stepped toward the horse. The knight dismounted. The knight picked Annie up and put her on the back of his horse. "Come on, Jack," Annie called. Jack moved slowly toward the knight. The knight lifted him up too and put him on the horse behind Annie. The knight then got on behind them. He slapped the reins. The black horse cantered beside the moonlit water of the moat. Jack rocked back and forth in the saddle. The wind blew his hair. He felt very brave and very powerful. He felt as if he could ride forever on this horse, with this mysterious knight, over the ocean, over the world, over the moon. A hawk shrieked in the darkness. "There's the tree house," said Annie. She pointed toward a grove of trees. The knight guided the horse toward the trees. "See, there it is," Annie said, pointing to the ladder. The knight brought his horse to a stop. He dismounted and helped Annie and Jack down. "Thank you, sir," Annie said. She bowed. "Thank you," Jack said. He bowed too. The knight got back on his horse. He raised his gloved hand. Then he slapped the reins and rode off through the mist. Annie started up the tall ladder, and Jack followed. They climbed into the dark tree house and looked out the window. The knight was riding toward the outer wall of the castle. They saw him go through the outer gate. Clouds started to cover the moon again. For a brief moment, Jack thought he saw the knight's armor gleaming on the top of a hill beyond the castle. The clouds covered the moon completely. A black mist swallowed the land. "He's gone," whispered Annie. Jack shivered in his wet clothes as he kept staring at the blackness. "I'm cold," said Annie. "Where's the Pennsylvania book?" Jack heard Annie fumbling in the darkness. He kept looking out the window. "I think this is it," said Annie. "I feel a silk bookmark." Jack was only half listening. He was hoping to see the knight's armor gleam again in the distance. "Okay, I'm going to use this," said Annie. "Because I think it's the right one. Here goes. Okay, I'm pointing. I'm going to make a wish. I wish we could go to Frog Creek." Jack heard the wind begin to blow softly. "I hope I pointed to the right picture in the right book," said Annie. "What?" Jack looked back at her. "Right picture? Right book?" The treehouse began to rock. The wind got louder and louder. "I hope it wasn't the dinosaur book," said Annie. "Stop!" Jack shouted at the treehouse. Too late. The tree house started to spin. It spun faster and faster. Then everything was still, absolutely still. Chapter 10. One mystery solved. The air was warm. It was dawn. Far away a dog barked. "I think that's Henry barking," Annie said. Jack and Annie both looked out the treehouse window. "We're home," said Annie. "Yay! That was close," said Jack. In the distance, streetlights glowed near their house. There was a light on in their upstairs window. "Uh-oh," said Annie. "I think Mom and Dad are up. Hurry." "Wait." In a daze, Jack opened his pack. He pulled out the castle book. It was quite wet, but Jack placed it back with all the other books. "Come on," said Annie. She started climbing out of the tree house. Jack followed her down the rope ladder. They reached the ground and took off running between the gray-black trees. They left the woods and ran down their quiet street. They got to their yard and crept across the lawn. They opened the front door carefully and slipped inside their house. "They're not downstairs yet," whispered Annie. "Shh," said Jack. He led the way up the stairs and down the hall. There was no sign of their mom or dad. But Jack could hear water running in the bathroom. Their house was so different from the dark, cold castle. It was safe and cozy and friendly. Annie stopped at her bedroom door. She gave Jack a smile, then disappeared inside her room. Jack hurried into his room. He took off his damp clothes and pulled on his dry, soft pajamas. He sat down on his bed and opened his backpack. He took out his wet notebook. He felt around for the pencil, but his hand touched something else. Jack pulled the blue leather bookmark out of his pack. It must have fallen out of the castle book. Jack held the bookmark close to his lamp and studied it. The leather was smooth and worn. It seemed ancient. For the first time, Jack noticed a letter on the bookmark. It was a fancy M. Jack opened the drawer next to his bed. He took out the gold medallion. He looked at the letter on it. It was the same M. Now this was an amazing new fact. Jack took a deep breath. At least, that was one mystery solved. The person who had dropped the gold medallion in the time of the dinosaurs was the same person who owned all the books in the treehouse. Who was this person? Jack placed the bookmark next to the medallion. He closed the drawer. Jack picked up his pencil. He turned to the least wet page in his notebook and started to write down this new fact. The same, but before he could draw the M, his eyes closed. Jack dreamed they were with the night again. All three of them were riding the black horse through the cool, dark night. They rode beyond the outer wall of the castle and up over a moonlit hill. Then they all rode into the mist.